LML in 13. Dawn is the original ice. Part 1. Hey guys, happy holidays. Thanks for joining me. My name is Lucifer means Lightbringer, but please, call me LML. I'm here with a 13-minute version of why the ancestral sword of House Dayne, known as Dawn, might actually be the original ice of House Stark. It's a possibility that occurred to me when I first began analyzing A Song of Ice and Fire in earnest. And apparently I'm not the only one, as I soon discovered when I ventured out onto the fan forums for the first time. That's right, Dawn is the original ice of House Stark is actually an old idea, which has been floating around on the margins of the fandoms for quite some time. It's a fun theory and worth exploring, so let's do it. Let me start by explaining exactly what I mean when I say the original ice of House Stark. This is from the second chapter of A Game of Thrones, when Lady Catelyn comes upon Ned cleaning ice in the Winterfell Godswood. Catelyn had no love for swords, but she could not deny that ice had its own beauty. It had been forged in Valyria before the doom had come to the old freehold, when the ironsmiths had worked their metal with spells as well as hammers. 400 years old it was, and as sharp as the day it was forged. The name it bore was older still, a legacy from the Age of Heroes, when the Starks were kings in the north. In other words, the Valyrian steel sword named Ice that Ned carries around is about 400 years old, but the tradition of the Starks naming their swords called Ice is actually thousands of years old, dating back to the Age of Heroes. The Age of Heroes is a term that the Maesters and the people of Westeros used to refer to the centuries and millennia leading up to the Long Night. It's a time marked by stories of legendary heroes such as Lan the Clever, Garth the Green, Durrandurrendon, and of course, Bran the Builder, the founder of House Stark. Thus, we can infer that the tradition of the Starks naming their swords Ice pretty much goes back to the very origins of House Stark, or at the very least, to the time before the Long Night. All of this begs the question, how did this tradition begin? Why did the Starks name their swords Ice? Did they once wield swords of actual ice like the others? What was the original ice, and what happened to it? Well, there's good reason to believe that it ended up down at Starfall, renamed Dawn, and placed there for safekeeping. Dawn is a huge white sword after all, so what better name for it than Ice? The theory goes like this. The last hero is said to have won the War for the Dawn by slaying others with a blade of Dragonsteel, which they could not stand against. That sword may have been Dawn, or Lightbringer, or maybe both. Either name would make sense for the name of a sword that helped end the Long Night, which amounts to bringing the dawn and bringing the light. Now, who was this last hero? Well, I think most people would say that he was probably a Stark. There are other possibilities, sure, but I think most would agree that's the likely answer. In other words, there is a very plausible scenario where the Long Night was ended by a Stark last hero wielding Dawn. But it may not have been named Dawn yet. The oldest northern myth of the last hero names his sword as Dragonsteel, though that seems more like a description than a name. It's possible that this Stark last hero named his huge, magical white sword Ice, and assuming they had some reason to give it to the Danes after the War for the Dawn was over, it would kind of make sense if the Starks then began a tradition of naming their primary sword Ice in remembrance of the original Ice, which was renamed Dawn after it helped bring the dawn. Think of Aragorn of The Lord of the Rings, who's destined to wield Narsil, the reforged sword of his ancestors, which had been out of their possession for thousands of years, since the last battle with the big bad evil. Similarly, it may be that Dawn was originally a Stark sword and is destined to once again be wielded by a Stark for the last battle. I mean, it does make a certain amount of sense, now doesn't it? So let's back up and take this one step at a time. The legend of the last hero slaying the others with a blade of Dragonsteel comes from the oldest records that Sam and Jon find at Castle Black. Jon and Sam wonder if the term Dragonsteel might not mean Valyrian steel, but all the information that we have about Valyria indicates that it arose only after the Long Night, and thus did not exist to provide the last hero with any of their prized steel. Dawn, however, is said to be very similar to Valyrian steel, and it's also said to be old enough to have been the last hero's sword. This is from the World of Ice and Fire. The Danes of Starfall are one of the most ancient houses in the Seven Kingdoms, though their fame largely rests on their ancestral sword called Dawn and the men who wielded it. Its origins are lost to legend, but it seems likely that the Danes have carried it for thousands of years. Those who have had the honor of examining it say it looks like no Valyrian steel they know, being pale as milk glass, but in all other respects it seems to share the properties of Valyrian blades, being incredibly strong and sharp. Dawn is basically like white Valyrian steel, as best as the maesters can tell, so it would potentially make sense as a sword that could stand against the others in the way that Dragonglass can, and in the way that Valyrian steel probably can. Show canon says yes, book canon says probably, but it's not proven yet. Dawn may well have been around at the time of the Long Night too. Here it says that the Danes are an ancient First Man house, one of the oldest in the Seven Kingdoms, and in A Feast for Crows, Gerald Darkstar Dane says that my house goes back 10,000 years into the dawn of days. Not only do the Danes supposedly go back to the dawn of days, the sword does too, and this is again from the world of Ice and Fire. At the mouth of the Torrentine, House Dayne raised its castle on an island where that roaring, tumultuous river broadens to meet the sea. Legend says the first Dane was led to the site when he followed the track of a falling star, and there found a stone of magical powers. His descendants ruled over the western mountains for centuries thereafter as kings of the Torrentine and lords of Starfall. Now, we have no way of knowing how much of this is true, of course, but the point is that the legend of House Dayne ties the creation of this magic sword to the origins of their house, and places these events in the remotest antiquity. I'll also point out that it even makes sense to describe Dawn as Dragonsteel, because Dawn is thought to have been made from a meteorite. Throughout real-world history, meteors and comets, burning brightly in the sky with their long tails, have been remembered in myth and legend as dragons or flying, fire-breathing serpents. And George R.R. Martin makes use of this comets-dragons analogy many times in A Song of Ice and Fire. Therefore, the idea of describing a sword made from a meteorite as Dragonsteel actually makes a ton of sense. If meteors can be dragons, then meteorite steel would be Dragonsteel. Very logical, those first men. So, Dawn is probably old enough to have been the sword of the last hero, and it seems to be the kind of unbreakable magic sword that might be able to stand against the others. The term Dragonsteel could describe Dawn, and the names Dawn and Sword of the Morning sound like names that might have origins in the ending of the Long Night. Like we said a minute ago, most people think the last hero was a Stark, and a lot of people think the last hero might have wielded Dawn. Therefore, the idea of a Stark last hero wielding Dawn isn't far-fetched in the least. I'm simply alleging that it wasn't named Dawn until after it helped bring the dawn and end the Long Night, and that the ancient Stark tradition of naming their swords Ice dates back to this one crucial time when a Stark last hero wielded a giant, shiny white sword that looked as though it was made of unbreakable ice. Unfortunately, Dawn, to the best of everyone's knowledge, has always been kept at Starfall, which is basically as far from Winterfell as you can get, still remaining inside Westeros, and there's no overt clues that Dawn was originally the sword of House Stark. Still, a lot of people think that Dawn might have been the last hero's sword, and if so, it had to go north and come back south again somehow. I think it's safe to assume that the Sword of Destiny, whatever and wherever it was, managed to find a way to show up to the last battle. Here, however, the trail sort of runs cold, pun intended, at least as far as direct evidence and logic goes. It's a bunch of maybes and what-ifs and this might make sense ifs. It's not bad as theories go, but I crave more evidence. And it's there to be found, though to find it we have to look through the symbolism surrounding Dawn and House Dayne and House Stark and even the others. And we have to look for potential parallels to the War for the Dawn in other historical events. Fortunately, that's exactly the sort of analysis we like to do around here, so this is actually where this theory begins, not where it ends. And now it begins, said Sir Arthur Dayne, the Sword of the Morning. He unsheathed Dawn and held it with both hands. The blade was pale as milk glass, alive with light. No, Ned said with sadness in his voice. Now it ends. No, now it begins. Now, the first thing I want to tell you is that I don't know if we'll actually see anyone wielding Dawn against the others at the conclusion of the story. What I do know is that if someone is going to swing that thing at the others, Jon Snow is by far the most likely candidate. The Danes we know of just won't work. Darkstar is too evil and vain, and Edric, though valiant, is only 13 and not big or strong enough to wield Dawn. Both of them are fairly minor characters too, so I don't think they would really make sense as a focal point for the War for the Dawn at the conclusion of the story. I do think that one or both of these characters will be involved in bringing Dawn out of Starfall and into the fray, if that's what's going to happen. Darkstar seems primed to steal it for one thing, but neither are really fit to wield it in a meaningful way against the others. Jon Snow, however, would be a great candidate to wield Dawn against the others, except that he's not a Dane. Well, he does have some Dane blood, actually. Assuming he's the child of Rhaegar and Lyanna, his Targaryen half does have a not insignificant amount of Dayne blood going back a few generations to Maekar Targaryen and Deanna Dayne. I'd be very surprised if that lineage was used to name Jon the Sword of the Morning in the usual fashion, however, as he's not in any sense a knight of House Dayne. But here's the thing. Jon doesn't need to be a Dayne to wield dawn. Not if dawn is the original ice of House Stark. The real Sword of the Morning is the person who actually brings the dawn, right? The person who ends the long night? And if there's one person who's going to play the warrior role against the others, it's certainly Jon, I would think. If dawn is the sword that needs to be wielded against the others, well, Jon is probably going to be the one to wield it, one way or the other. And as it happens, there is specific foreshadowing of the idea of a Stark wielding dawn hidden in some thinly disguised wordplay. 4 times in the published novels, George Martin describes a sword as running, glimmering, or shimmering with morning light, i.e. dawn light, and all 4 times the sword is associated with the Starks. 3 of the 4 occurrences have a Stark holding the sword, and the one time it isn't a Stark wielding the sword, it is an actual Stark sword. The settings where we get these morning light swords are amazing too. Robb Stark is the first one to wield the morning light, and it occurs during the only time that we see him enthroned as a true King of the North, or King of Winter, as Mage Mormont correctly yells out. He's actually doing a near-perfect impression of the stone statues of the Kings of Winter from the Winterfell crypts. He's got his dire wolf at his side, and his sword across his lap, a threat plain for all to see, as it says. Catelyn observes her Robb, transforming into the icy King of the North, and it says, "Her son's voice was not as icy as his father's would have been, but he did not sound a boy of 15 either. War had made a man of him before his time. Morning light glimmered faintly against the edge of the steel across his knees." As you can see, Robb is specifically enthroned in the archetypal manner of the Stark kings of old, and it is then that the author paints the edge of his sword with morning light. Robb is even demanding the return of his father's sword Ice in this scene, which has unfortunately been melted down to make 2 new swords, Oathkeeper and Widow's Wail. Funny thing about Widow's Wail, though. The ballroom fell silent as Joffrey unsheathed the blade and thrust the sword above his head. Red and black ripples in the steel shimmered in the morning light. Joffrey is unfit to wield Stark steel, I think that's safe to say, and indeed, he dies later that day at his own wedding feast. But those Stark swords, man, they sure do seem to glimmer and shimmer with morning light, don't they? The other 2 times it happens, the swordsman is none other than our boy Jon Snow, the special snowflake. It happens twice in 1 chapter, actually, and it's the A Dance with Dragons chapter where Jon is imitating his father Ned as someone who both passes the sentence and swings the sword. The first time the morning light shimmers, he's even thinking about Ned and the way that he taught his sons to care for their swords. Half the morning passed before Lord Janos reported as commanded. Jon was cleaning Longclaw. Some men would have given that task to a steward or a squire, but Lord Eddard had taught his sons to care for their own weapons. When Keggs and Dolorous arrived with Slint, Jon thanked them and bid Lord Janos sit. That he did, albeit with poor grace, crossing his arms, scowling, and ignoring the naked steel in his Lord Commander's hands. Jon slid the oilcloth down his bastard sword, watching the play of morning light across the ripples, thinking how easily the blade would slide through skin and fat and sinew to part Slint's ugly head from his body. Saying that the morning light is playing across the ripples is almost as good as saying it's alive with light. And it's morning light. Jon goes on to think about how this man killed his father, and at the end of the chapter he does, of course, end up executing Janos in the famous "Ed, fetch me a block" scene. And once again, the sword runs with morning light. The pale morning sunlight ran up and down his blade as Jon clasped the hilt of the bastard sword with both hands and raised it high. The morning light is even pale here, just as dawn is as pale as milk glass and alive with light, and was made from a pale stone, and comes from a place where they have a tower called the Pale Stone Sword. Jon is executing a renegade Night's Watchman, just as Ned did to open the story, and Jon is thinking about doing things the way that Ned did them, and when he does, his sword runs with morning light. Why? Because a Stark named Jon Snow may be destined to wield dawn as the sword in the darkness, bringing the light of morning to the land once again with the ancient ice sword of his ancestors. Thanks for tuning in, everybody, and if you like this one, please be sure to share it far and wide. And watch out for part 2, where we'll continue to examine the symbolic evidence that Dawn was once called